She didn't cry when she found them together. She didn't scream, didn't throw anything, didn't demand explanations the way every woman in every movie is supposed to do when her world collapses. Sloane Mercer simply stood in that doorway, her doorway, in her house, on her sofa, and watched her husband laugh at another woman's joke like he hadn't laughed in years, like something inside him had been freed. And the worst part? The part that no one tells you about moments like this? She wasn't even surprised. That's what 12 years of being slowly erased does to a person. It doesn't kill you all at once. It happens so quietly you almost don't notice. Until one Tuesday evening in the rain, you're standing in your own living room feeling like a stranger, and the man who once said you were the smartest person he'd ever met is sitting 3 feet away from another woman, completely forgetting that you exist. If that were you, if you had given someone everything, rebuilt them from nothing, and watched them hand your life to someone else, what would you do? Stay for this story, because what Sloane does next will change everything. And if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now because we tell stories like this every week. Stories about strength, betrayal, and the kind of quiet justice that makes your heart pound. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Par. The rain had been falling since 4 in the afternoon, the kind of slow, heavy rain that doesn't announce itself with thunder. It just arrives and stays, soaking through everything. Sloane noticed it when she was still in the car, sitting in the parking structure of her office building for 11 extra minutes because she wasn't ready to go home yet. That should have told her something. She was 41 years old, healthy, dressed well, successful by any reasonable standard. She had a company with her name on the door, clients in 6 countries, and a reputation in financial intelligence circles that had taken her 15 years to build from nothing. None of that had come from her husband. She needed people to understand that. She'd needed that for a long time. But the house, that enormous fortified lake house with the cameras at every corner and the black sedans always parked in the circular driveway like a permanent warning, that house had started to feel like a sentence she was serving, not a place she lived. She drove home anyway. She always did. The front gate opened when her car approached, the way it always did. The guards nodding without expression, the security lights flooding the driveway in that cold, white way that always made her feel slightly watched, even on her own property. She parked, killed the engine, and sat there for another moment listening to rain on the roof. Then she went inside. She heard the laughter before she cleared the entryway. It was soft. A woman's laugh, low and comfortable, the kind of laugh that doesn't perform for anyone, the kind you only produce when you feel completely at home. Sloane stopped walking. She tilted her head slightly, the way an analyst does when a number doesn't fit the pattern, and she listened. Then she followed the sound. She moved through the hallway without rushing, past the photographs she'd chosen for the walls, past the side table she'd picked out from a market in Florence, past 12 years of selections and decisions and small personal choices that had accumulated into what other people called a beautiful home. She reached the entrance to the living room and stopped. Valeria Knox was sitting on Sloane's sofa. She had a wine glass in her right hand. Good wine, from the color of it, probably from the rack Sloane kept in the climate-controlled cabinet. And her shoes were off, and she was turned sideways on the cushions in a way that suggested she had been there long enough to get comfortable. She was 44, dark-haired, immaculately put together even now, and she had the kind of face that always looked like it was privately winning something. Dante stood across from her. He was still in his work clothes, dress shirt open, 2 buttons at the collar, jacket draped somewhere. And his gun holster was sitting on the armchair like he'd set it down the moment he walked in, which he never did. He was never that relaxed. Not in years. He was laughing at something Valeria had just said, and the laugh reached his eyes in a way that Sloane recognized from a long time ago, from a version of him that she had believed was meant for her. Neither of them heard her. She stood in that doorway for what felt like a very long time, long enough that she understood the full picture, long enough that her brain ran through every explanation and eliminated all the comfortable ones, long enough to feel the exact weight of what this was. Then she turned and walked upstairs. Her feet were quiet on the steps. Her breathing was controlled. She passed the landing mirror without looking at herself, went into the bedroom, opened the closet on the left side, and pulled down the large suitcase from the top shelf. She set it on the bed. She opened it, and she began to pack. She didn't take everything. She didn't need to. She took the things that were actually hers, not the jewelry he'd given her as apology gifts after arguments she'd lost, not the cashmere things he'd bought because he felt guilty in that particular way he had of using gifts instead of conversations. She took her own things, books she'd annotated, her grandmother's watch, the small framed photograph from her graduation that had somehow survived 12 years of moves and renovations, and the general chaos of building a life with Dante Viscari. She heard him on the stairs before she saw him. "Sloan." His voice was already in damage control mode, that particular register he used when he needed to de-escalate a situation quickly. It worked on lieutenants. It worked on politicians who'd gotten cold feet. It had worked on her more times than she could honestly count. "Sloan, stop. Listen to me. It isn't what you're thinking." She kept packing. She was here for a meeting, a political thing. There's a city council vote next week, and she's been coordinating the... Don't. Sloan said it quietly. He stopped talking. The silence stretched. He came further into the room, running a hand through his hair, and she saw the particular stress pattern in his jaw that meant he was calculating, thinking through approaches. "I know how it looked," he said. "I know that. But you have to let me explain. I know you're going to tell me it was a mistake." She folded a blouse and placed it in the suitcase. Her hands were completely steady. "And I know you probably believe it. That's the part you need to understand, Dante. You've always been very good at believing the version of yourself that costs you the least." He crossed the room toward her. "Sloan, she wasn't just here tonight." She turned to face him then, for the first time since she'd come upstairs, and she watched his expression shift through several stages before settling on something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite defiance. "We both know that." He didn't confirm it. He also didn't deny it. That was answer enough. She turned back to the suitcase. She picked up her grandmother's watch from the nightstand and held it in her palm for a moment before wrapping it carefully in a sweater. "You want me to say I'm sorry," Dante said. His voice had changed. The damage control register was gone, replaced by something that was closer to honest, which was rarer from him and therefore harder to listen to. "I am sorry. I know that doesn't fix it. I know I..." "Dante." She zipped the suitcase. "Do you know when you actually lost me?" He didn't answer. "Not tonight." She turned to face him again. She looked at him the way she used to look at his ledgers, directly, without flinching, looking for the thing the numbers were hiding. "You lost me 3 years ago at the Hargrove Foundation dinner, when Senator Calloway asked how you'd restructured the port agreements, and you explained my entire strategy for 45 minutes without saying my name once." He opened his mouth. "You lost me before that, at your uncle's retirement, when you introduced me to the Marchetti family and called me the woman who keeps my home peaceful. Peaceful." She said the word like it tasted wrong. "You lost me every single time I showed you a solution and watched you present it to the room as something that had come to you in the night. Every time I was in the room and still invisible. Every time you needed my mind but wanted me quiet about it." Dante stood very still. "I kept waiting," she said, "for you to see me. And you kept not seeing me. And eventually I stopped waiting and started building something that didn't require your permission to exist." She lifted the suitcase off the bed. He moved then, fast, and put his hand on the handle beside hers. Not stopping her. Or maybe stopping her. She wasn't sure. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him in so long that it took her a moment to identify it. It was the expression he'd worn in that diner booth 15 years ago when she told him which of his captains was selling him out, and he'd looked at her like she was something he hadn't known was possible. "Tell me what to do," he said. It came out rough and real, and too late. She eased the suitcase out from under his hand. She walked to the dresser, opened the small dish where she kept it, and picked up her wedding ring. She held it for one breath, maybe two. Then she set it on the wood surface, gently, like she was putting something down that had been heavy for a long time. "You didn't lose me tonight," she said. "You lost me every time you made me disappear." She walked out of the room. He didn't follow her down the stairs. The guards at the gate looked at her suitcase and then carefully looked away. One of them, a man named Reyes who had worked the property for 6 years, held the pedestrian gate open for her without being asked. It was raining harder now. She hadn't brought an umbrella. She walked to her car, which was still in the driveway, put the suitcase in the trunk, and drove away from the house without once checking the rearview mirror. Not because she wasn't tempted, but because she had promised herself, somewhere during those 11 minutes in the parking garage, that if she left, she would leave like a person who knew where they were going. She hadn't always known where she was going. 15 years ago, Sloane Mercer had been working the late shift at a diner called Salerno's, a neighborhood place that smelled like fried bread and old coffee, with a counter that wobbled when you leaned on it and a cash register that stuck on the number 4. She was 26, 3 credits away from finishing her economics degree at night while working days at a credit union and nights at Salerno's. And she was very tired in the specific way of someone who hasn't slept more than 5 hours at a stretch in several years. She was also, even then, incapable of ignoring a problem. The man in the back booth had come in around 11, ordered coffee and nothing else, and spread a collection of papers and ledgers across the table in a way that suggested either profound disorganization or profound stress. She noticed him the way she noticed things, automatically, without deciding to, the way a musician hears a wrong note before they can name it. She refilled his coffee at midnight. She refilled it again at 12:30. At 1:45, he was still staring at the same page, and she had already identified from 3 separate glances across the restaurant that his route numbers didn't reconcile with his payment columns. She shouldn't have said anything. She knew that. A girl working a diner at 1 in the morning had no business commenting on the financial documents of a man who had the specific kind of stillness that meant he was dangerous. She said something anyway. "Your column 3 numbers," she said, topping off his cup without being asked. "They're being pulled twice. Someone's billing the same route twice under different codes. You've got about 140,000 gap. That's not a loss. It's a skim." He looked up at her. Dante Viscari was 29 years old, and at that point in his life he looked like someone who had been through things he hadn't yet figured out how to carry. His father had been murdered 8 months earlier. His uncle was pressuring him to hand over operations. 2 rival families were circling like they could smell blood in the water. He had a fractured organization, debts that had been called in all at once like a coordinated attack, which, as Sloane would later understand, it was. And he was sitting in a diner booth at midnight because it was one of the few places he felt like no one was watching him die. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the ledger, then back at her. "Show me," he said. She sat down across from him, which she absolutely should not have done. She pulled the ledger toward her and pointed. 5 minutes of explanation. He asked 2 questions, both precise, both smart. She answered them. He sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and she could see the calculation running behind his eyes. And then he said, quietly, "Caruso." She didn't know the name. She didn't need to. "You should get someone to verify that before you do anything," she said, because she was practical. "Make sure I'm reading it right." "You're reading it right," he said. He was still looking at the ceiling, then he looked at her. "What's your name?" "Sloane." "How do you know how to read these?" "Economics. And I've seen people steal from registers since I was 16. The principle's the same, just bigger numbers." Something shifted in his expression. It was the first version of that look. The one she would come to know. The one that said she was something he hadn't expected. He came back the next night, and the night after that. The third night, he told her about the ambush that had been planned for a shipment moving through the eastern docks, and she helped him reroute it, not through instinct, but through a clean analysis of which corridors were monitored and which had enough distance to allow a redirect without detection. It was a logistics problem. She liked logistics problems. The ambush hit an empty warehouse. 2 weeks after that, his organization was still standing when everyone with a stake in the city had expected it to fold. And Dante Viscari, reckless and scarred and suddenly very still, the way dangerous things get when they find solid ground, looked at Sloane across a table covered in her handwritten notes and said, "I want you to stay." It hadn't been a romantic thing, he said it. Not exactly. It was more like an acknowledgement, like he understood already what she was. She should have negotiated better terms, but she was 26 and she had never been seen quite that clearly by anyone, and she told herself that was worth more than terms. The first years were honest, at least. They worked together in the cramped office above a printing business, in the back rooms of his cousin's restaurant, in the car between meetings when there wasn't time to stop. Sloan built him a reorganized distribution system that cut his overhead by 30% and made his lieutenants, for the first time, accountable to a structure rather than to personal loyalty alone. She identified 2 more internal thefts. She negotiated a territory agreement with the Ferrano family that Dante's own lawyer had called impossible, because she had found the clause in the original agreement that the Ferranos had been violating for 7 years, and used it as leverage so precisely that they didn't realize until the signing that they'd been outmaneuvered. Dante told her afterward, in that quiet way of his, that she was the best strategist he'd ever sat across from. He meant it as a compliment. She took it as one. She didn't notice for a long time how the compliments changed texture. How "you're brilliant" became "I figured something out today" when he told the story to others. How the space she occupied in his professional world slowly became invisible even as the footprint of her work grew larger. He never lied to her directly. He just didn't correct the record. The first time it bothered her enough to say something, they were driving home after a dinner with city officials, and he'd spent the whole evening accepting credit for the waterfront acquisition that she'd spent 4 months structuring. She said, carefully, that she wished he'd mentioned her involvement. He looked genuinely puzzled. "Sloan," he said, "everybody who matters knows what you mean to me." Which was not the same thing at all. But she let it go. She let it go several hundred more times after that, each one smaller than the last, until the accumulation of small surrenders had quietly become the shape of her life. She started Mercer Blackstone in her 41st year, on a Tuesday, in an office she'd rented with her own money, under her maiden name, with no announcement. She didn't tell Dante for 2 months, not because she was hiding it, but because she was building it, and she had learned, somewhere in those 12 years, that things built in silence had a better chance of surviving. By the time she told him, she already had 3 clients. He was supportive. She gave him credit for that, even now. He said he was proud of her, and she believed he meant it, in the way he meant most things, genuinely, but at a certain remove from a position of someone who didn't understand why she needed it. He still called her the quiet wife at galas. He still interrupted her at dinners. And she still drove home in the rain and sat in parking garages longer than necessary, because going home had started to feel like retreating. The morning after she left, she checked into a hotel under her company name. She slept 4 hours, broken, close to the surface sleep, the kind where you keep half waking and reminding yourself where you are. When she got up, she made coffee from the room machine and stood at the window and looked at the city still wet from last night's rain, and she thought about what came next. She wasn't afraid. That was the thing she kept coming back to, turning it over like something unexpected she'd found in her pocket. She had left the most protected address in the city and walked out into the rain with a suitcase, and she was not afraid. She was, if she was honest, relieved. She opened her laptop. She had client emails to answer. She had a quarterly analysis due for a shipping consortium in Rotterdam. She had work, real work, work that had her name on it and no one else's, and she sat down at the small hotel desk and began. Dante called 4 times before noon. She didn't answer. She had known, leaving the house, that it would not be simple. She had built too much of his world to pretend she could extract herself quietly. There were complicated threads, financial, operational, personal, that would take months to unspool. She wasn't naive about that. What she hadn't counted on was what Dante found when he went looking for her. She didn't know that yet. She was drinking bad hotel coffee and writing a risk assessment for Rotterdam, and she was, for the first time in years, the only person in the room she needed to explain herself to. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough. Dante didn't sleep. He told himself he would, after the 3rd call she didn't answer, after the 4th, after he'd walked through every room in the house twice like he was looking for something she might have left behind besides the ring. He poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey and sat in the kitchen, which was the one room in the house that didn't feel like it had been designed to impress anyone. And he stared at the ring sitting on the counter where he'd carried it down from the dresser without deciding to. It was a simple ring. She'd picked it herself. He'd offered something larger, and she'd said, "I don't need large, I need right." And she'd pointed to that one. And he'd thought at the time that was just Sloan. Precise, unsentimental, always knowing exactly what she wanted. He hadn't understood until approximately 3 in the morning, sitting alone in his kitchen with rain still hitting the windows, that knowing what you want and getting it are two different problems. Sloane had always known what she wanted. She'd just spent 12 years wanting it from the wrong person. He pushed the ring to the center of the counter and went upstairs. He did not sleep. He lay on his back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about the Hargrove Foundation dinner. 3 years ago, Senator Calloway, who was a small man with large ambitions and the particular kind of smile that meant he was always counting what he was owed, Dante had explained the port restructuring for 45 minutes, and he remembered, now lying in the dark, that at one point Calloway had asked, "Who did the original modeling on the throughput analysis?" And Dante had said, "My team," and moved on. His team. Sloane, alone at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with 3 reference books open and a legal pad covered in her handwriting, had been his team. He closed his eyes. He opened them again. It didn't help either way. At 5:40 he got up, showered, and went to her office. Mercer Blackstone occupied the 7th floor of a glass building in the financial district, and at 6 in the morning the lobby was empty except for a security guard who recognized Dante and went very still in that particular way people went still around him. Not quite fear, not quite respect, somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. Dante showed himself to the elevator. He knew the floor. He'd been there exactly once, for the opening, when Sloane had given him a brief tour with the careful pride of someone showing you something they made themselves, and watching to see if you understood what that meant. He hadn't understood. He'd said impressive, and meant it, but he'd said it the way you compliment a hobby. He used his emergency override on the office lock. She'd given him the code 2 years ago for what she called logistical reasons, and went in. The office was dark and clean and organized in a way that looked effortless but wasn't. He'd been in enough operational spaces to know that this kind of order took discipline. There were no personal photographs on her desk. There was one on the bookshelf behind it. The graduation photo she'd packed last night, he realized, was gone. A small rectangle of lighter wood where it had sat. He wasn't sure why that hit him harder than the empty space on her finger. He didn't touch her desk. He stood in the middle of the office for a moment and looked around, and then he did the thing he'd come to do, the thing he'd been turning over since 4 in the morning when the thought first arrived and wouldn't leave. He went to the archive room. Sloane had mentioned it once, in passing, calling it the filing system, which he'd understood to mean client records, compliance documents, the ordinary paper infrastructure of a consulting firm. She'd mentioned, also in passing, that it was locked with a biometric seal, which he'd assumed was standard security practice for a firm dealing with sensitive financial data. It was standard. It was also, as he stood in front of the door and studied the lock, the kind of standard that cost significantly more than standard usually did. He called a man named Ortega, who handled security systems for the organization and had, over the years, handled several locks he wasn't supposed to be handling. Ortega arrived at 7:15. He looked at the lock, said nothing for a moment, and then said, "This is a Vantage Series 7. Can you open it?" "I can open it. It's going to leave a record." "Open it." It took Ortega 22 minutes. Dante waited in the hallway, drinking coffee from a machine in the break room that was better than he expected, and he thought about Valeria. He had known, sitting in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, that Sloane was right about the timeline. It hadn't started last night. He'd been lying to himself about what Valeria was for a long time, in the way you lie to yourself about things that are easier not to examine. A layer of justification laid down early enough that you stop seeing it as justification and start seeing it as fact. Valeria had come into his world through a political connection 18 months ago, offering services as a fixer. The kind of person who made problems with city officials go away cleanly, who knew which alderman needed what, and delivered it without drama. She was good at her job. She was also, he understood now, extraordinarily good at appearing to be something other than what she was. She'd given him admiration in careful doses, the kind that felt like recognition rather than flattery, and he'd been hungry for it in a way he hadn't realized until she was already inside his defenses. "Done," Ortega said from the doorway. Dante went in. What he found in the first hour was what he expected. Client files, analysis reports, the paper record of a thriving independent consulting business. Sloane's work was meticulous in a way that was almost painful to read. Every recommendation sourced, every projection tracked against actual outcome, every client engagement documented with a precision that made his own organization's record-keeping look like notes on a napkin, which, in the early days, it had literally been. He found the client list in the third drawer of the second cabinet, and he sat down in the one chair in the archive room and read it. Some of the names he recognized as legitimate corporations. Some he recognized as organizations that operated, like his own, in the gray spaces between legal and otherwise. 3 he recognized as direct rivals. Not enemies exactly, more like neighboring powers whose interests had occasionally crossed his in uncomfortable ways. He stared at those 3 names for a while. She hadn't been working against him. He could see that clearly enough from the nature of the files. She'd been helping these organizations transition toward legitimate operations, cleaning up their financial structures, the same work she'd done for him in the early years, offered now to people who came to her directly. She'd built, without his knowledge, a practice in exactly the space where his world intersected with the legitimate one, and she'd done it under her own name without a single reference to him. He should have felt proud of her. He recognized, sitting in that archive room, that pride was the appropriate response. What he felt instead was the cold, specific shock of realizing how little space he'd taken up in her life for a very long time. He was on his third cabinet when he found the accordion folder at the back of the bottom drawer. It was thicker than the client files and labeled, in Sloane's handwriting, with a single word, internal. He opened it. The documents inside were organized chronologically, going back 14 months. Surveillance photographs. Some clearly professional, some taken from what looked like a dash cam or a building camera at a distance. Financial records with annotations in red ink. A printed transcript of what appeared to be a recorded phone call, with names redacted. A series of shipping manifests with routes highlighted. He read for a long time without moving. When he finally looked up, the light through the archive room's single high window had changed. It was later than he thought. The documents told a story he didn't want to believe and couldn't stop believing. Weapon shipments moving through his ports that he'd never authorized, under manifests that used his clearance codes but routed through a secondary accounting channel he hadn't known existed. Payments moving to people he recognized. 3 detectives, 2 of whom had handled sensitive operations for him in the past, and 1 of whom had died in what had been reported as an accident 4 months ago. Sloane had annotated that page. In her precise small handwriting, in red, next to the dead detective's name. Not an accident. Witness eliminated. And at the back of the folder, a photograph. His cousin Lucien, sitting across a restaurant table from Valeria Knox. The timestamp on the photograph was 16 months ago, 2 months before Valeria had first appeared in Dante's world through a political contact that Lucien had provided. Dante set the photograph down on the floor of the archive room. He sat very still. The thing about a betrayal this specific is that it doesn't feel like a surprise so much as a completion, like a shape you'd been seeing in the dark finally resolving into something you can name. Lucien. He'd known Lucien his whole life. He'd protected him, promoted him, defended him against 3 separate challenges from other factions who'd thought Lucien was weak. He'd given him the second chair in the organization because blood meant something, because family meant something, because after his father died, he'd needed to believe the people closest to him were fixed points. He picked up the photograph again. He looked at it for a long time. Then he called Lucien. Lucien answered on the second ring, which meant he wasn't nervous. Dante, where are you? I've been trying to reach you since last night. I heard about Sloane. Reyes told me she left. Are you... Come to the office, Dante said. I want to go over the quarterly route reports. A pause. 1 beat too long. Sure, Lucien said. Yeah. Give me an hour. Dante ended the call. He stood up, put the accordion folder back where he'd found it, and left the archive room exactly as he'd found it, because he needed Lucien to believe he hadn't been here. He walked out of the office. He told Ortega, in the lobby, to make sure the security record of the lock being opened was removed. All of it, he said, like we were never here. He drove to the organization's main office, which operated above a commercial shipping brokerage in the Port District, and he sat at his desk and waited. He looked at the surface of the desk. He'd had this desk for 9 years. It was old mahogany, bought at an estate sale. Sloane had found it. He stopped that line of thinking and focused. Lucien arrived at 9:45. He was 52, 15 years older than Dante, built like someone who'd spent his 20s doing physical work and his 50s eating well, with a face that had always read as trustworthy in a specific way. The kind of face that made you think of uncles, of neighborhood figures, of men who had seen everything and were unshockable. He came into the office with his usual ease, took the chair across the desk, and looked at Dante with an expression of genuine seeming concern. "You look terrible," Lucian said. "Did you sleep?" "No." "Dante." He shook his head slowly. "She'll come back. Sloane's practical. She's not going to walk away from 12 years because of the Meridian shipments," Dante said. Lucian's expression didn't change. That, more than anything, told Dante what he needed to know. An innocent man would have shown confusion. Lucian showed nothing, which meant he'd been prepared for some version of this conversation. "What about them, Lucian said. "Walk me through the routing decision. Why those manifests went through the secondary channel instead of the main?" "Cost efficiency. I told you about this in March. You signed off on it." "I signed off on route consolidation, not on a secondary accounting channel that doesn't run through compliance review." "They're the same thing." "They're not," Dante said. "And you know they're not." The silence in the room changed temperature. Lucian shifted in the chair. Not much, barely perceptible, but Dante had spent 30 years reading rooms, and he saw it. "I think," Lucian said carefully, "that you're dealing with a lot right now, with Sloane and everything, and maybe this isn't the best morning to—" "Valeria Knox," Dante said. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Lucian said nothing. "How long?" Dante asked. "Dante? How long have you known her?" Lucian looked at him for a long moment, and the trustworthy uncle expression finally cracked, not into guilt exactly, but into something older and colder underneath it. He leaned forward and put his forearms on the desk and looked at Dante with the first honest expression Dante had seen from him in what he was now realizing had been a very long time. "Long enough," Lucian said. "Why?" Lucian looked almost tired. "Because you've been running this organization on a woman's instincts for 15 years and you never once admitted it. Because every time someone questioned a decision, the real answer was Sloane figured it out. But you'd never say that, so the organization thought you were brilliant, and I watched you get smaller every year you spent accepting credit for someone else's work. And I thought—" He stopped. He reset. "I thought it was time for actual leadership." Dante's hands were flat on the desk. He was aware of them, keeping them flat, keeping his voice level. "You thought. The organization needs someone who built it, not someone who married into the brain that built it." The words came out clean and practiced, and Dante understood that Lucian had been saying some version of this to himself, and maybe to Valeria for a long time, that it had probably felt, in the saying of it, like principle, like vision, like something other than what it was. "She tried to tell me," Dante said. He wasn't talking to Lucian anymore, not really. "Months ago. She came to me with something about the port reports, and I told her she was reading too much into logistics data." He heard his own voice. "I told her she was being paranoid." Lucian said nothing. "You let her leave last night," Dante said. "You needed her out of the house." "I didn't orchestrate your marriage falling apart, Dante. You managed that yourself." "But you used it." He looked at his cousin. "You needed me distracted. Valeria was the distraction, and now Sloane is out of the house, out of the picture, and you've got the routing channel and the security codes that she used to verify. And—" He stopped. "The security codes." He reached for his phone. "The archive is already pulled," Lucian said quietly. "The physical one at the port facility. Our copies." Dante went still. "I've been planning this for 14 months, Lucian said. "I'm not sloppy." The phone in Dante's hand felt very heavy. He could feel the exact calculation he needed to make. What assets were still reachable, which captains were still his, what the next 6 hours looked like if he moved now versus if he waited. He was running the numbers, and they were not good. Lucian had 14 months. Dante had had this morning. "The men at the East facility," Dante said, "reassigned last week. Paperwork went through your signature. You signed a staffing memo in March that gave me consolidated personnel authority for Q2 operations. You didn't read it carefully." Dante had not read it carefully. He remembered the memo. He'd been in the middle of something else, something Sloane had brought him, that he'd set aside to deal with Lucian's paperwork. The specific texture of how comprehensively he'd been managed settled over him like cold water. He set the phone down. "You should call her," Lucian said. His voice had gone back to something that almost sounded like the uncle face. "Whatever happens with the organization, call Sloane. She deserves to know what's coming." "What's coming?" "By tonight, the Meridian Channel closes permanently and the routing goes dark. The ledger transfers. By tomorrow morning, a number of stories become available to federal investigators. Stories about the Vescari organization that are accurate enough to be useful, framed in ways that put the blame in specific places." He paused. "I've been careful about which places." Dante looked at him. "You'd hand the whole thing to the Federals." "I'd hand them a version of it, of one that leaves me building something new from the operational assets that survive, and one that leaves you answering for the parts of the last 15 years that don't look good in daylight." "You think I'd go down without taking you with me?" "I think you'd go down without being able to prove I was involved in anything you couldn't explain away." Lucian stood up. He straightened his jacket. He was calm in a way that Dante recognized as the calm of someone who has been rehearsing. "I think Sloane's files are the only thing that could change that. And I think you didn't know those files existed until this morning, which means you haven't thought yet about what happens if someone else finds them first." He walked to the door. "I'm not your enemy, Dante. I'm your consequence." He put his hand on the door frame. "You should have read her name into the room when Calloway asked. She would have stayed. She would have seen everything coming that I've spent 14 months building. But you needed to be the genius. And now here we are." He left. Dante sat at the mahogany desk that Sloane had found at an estate sale 9 years ago and listened to his cousin's footsteps go down the hall, and he thought about one thing with the focused clarity that only arrives when every other option is closing: the accordion folder in the archive room of Mercer Blackstone. Lucian didn't know Sloane had been documenting this. Lucian thought the files that mattered were the organization's operational records, the physical copies at the port facility, which he'd already pulled. He didn't know about 14 months of surveillance photographs and annotated shipping manifests and a transcript of a phone call with names redacted, but patterns that were not. Which meant for the next few hours, not many more than that, there was one set of files in the city that could end Lucian's plan before it finished starting, and the only person who knew exactly what was in those files was not answering her phone. Dante picked up his phone and called Sloane again. It rang 4 times. Voicemail. He didn't leave a message. He called again immediately, and this time it didn't even ring. Went straight to voicemail, which meant she'd seen the call and declined it, which meant she was awake and choosing not to. He drove. The hotel she'd used before when she traveled for client meetings was the Caldwell on 5th, and he drove there on instinct and called her room from the lobby phone because she never registered under her own name when she wanted not to be found. The desk clerk said they had no one by that name. He believed them. He called her assistant, a young woman named Priya, who had worked for Mercer Blackstone for 3 years, and who, upon hearing Dante's voice, became carefully and professionally neutral in the specific way of someone who has been given instructions. "I'm not able to share Ms. Mercer's location," Priya said. "Is there a message I can pass along?" "Tell her I found the internal file." A pause. "I'll let her know," Priya said, and her voice had shifted slightly, the professional neutral cracking just enough to reveal that she knew what that meant. He drove back to the port district. He needed to inventory what he still had. Which captains, which facilities, which communication channels Lucian hadn't yet quietly reassigned or redirected. He was doing the math, and the math was ugly. 14 months of preparation against 1 morning of information. The only variable in his favor was that Lucian thought he was operating in grief and shock, which meant Lucian expected him to be slower than he was. He was not going to be slow. He was 3 blocks from the port facility when his phone rang. Not Sloane, one of his captains, a man named Torres, who ran the South Dock operations and who did not call unless something was already wrong. "There's smoke coming out of the East Warehouse," Torres said. "Both of them. It started about 10 minutes ago. Nobody called the fire in. It went up fast." Dante looked at the road ahead of him. The East warehouses held the organization's reserve financial documents, original records going back 20 years. Pull everyone out of the south facility, he said. Right now. Don't wait for confirmation from anyone. Don't explain it. Just move your people. Dante, what's now, Torres? He ended the call. Through the windshield, he could see, at the edge of the port district, the beginning of a dark column of smoke rising against the pale morning sky. Lucien was not waiting. And then his phone rang again, and this time the number was one he didn't recognize, and he answered it because he was answering everything right now. It was not a voice he knew. Male, calm, with the specific flatness of someone delivering a professional communication. Mr. Vescari, my employer wants you to know that Ms. Mercer is safe and comfortable, and will remain so as long as you don't do anything in the next 6 hours that makes this more complicated than it needs to be. The smoke was fully visible now through the windshield, thick and black and rising fast. Put her on, Dante said. A brief silence. Then Sloane's voice, and the particular quality of it, controlled, furious, not frightened but not unaware of exactly what this was, hit him somewhere that had nothing to do with calculation. Don't do anything stupid, she said. I mean it. Whatever you're thinking right now, don't. Then the line went dead. Dante pulled to the side of the road. He looked at the smoke. He thought about Lucien's face when he said, I've been planning this for 14 months. He thought about the accordion folder in Sloane's archive. He thought about Sloane's voice on the phone, controlled, but underneath the control, something that was almost anger and almost something else, something that said she was already working the problem from whatever room they were keeping her in. She was already working it. He just needed to not get in her way while not letting her die. He pulled back onto the road. He was not going to the port facility. He had one call to make, to a man he'd kept in reserve for 10 years for a situation exactly this bad. And then he was going to do the thing Lucien would least expect from a man whose wife had just left him, and whose empire was on fire. He was going to think. Dante made the call from the car, pulled over on a side street 2 blocks from the smoke. The man he called was named Harwell. Not an organization man, never had been. Harwell was what you kept outside the organization precisely because the organization could be compromised. He was 63 years old, worked out of a law office that handled legitimate corporate work 80% of the time, and in the remaining 20%, he was the person you called when the legitimate world and the other one needed to communicate without destroying each other. Dante had kept him on retainer for a decade and called him 4 times. This was the 5th. I need you to pull everything movable from the Mercer Blackstone archive on the 7th floor of the Callaway building, Dante said. Everything in the room marked internal. Do it in the next 2 hours. That's a private business's records, Harwell said. He wasn't objecting, just establishing the parameters. The owner is my wife. We're not divorced. Are you separated? As of last night. A pause. That's a gray area. I know what it is. Can you do it? I can have someone there in 40 minutes. They'll need the access code. Dante gave him Ortega's number and told him Ortega would handle the lock. He ended the call and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, looking at nothing in particular, and then he drove north. He needed to think about who had Sloane and where. Lucien wouldn't use an organization facility. Those were too exposed now, too likely to become evidence. He'd use something clean, something with distance, something that couldn't be traced back through the usual channels. That meant a private arrangement. Lucien had been planning this for 14 months, which meant the location had been selected well in advance, which meant it wasn't improvised. Dante thought about the properties he knew Lucien controlled personally. The apartment on Mercer Street, too visible, too urban. The house in the county his ex-wife had signed over in the settlement, possible, but known. And then there was the steel mill. The Calderon steel mill had been inactive for 11 years. It sat on the edge of the industrial waterfront, outside the main port district, in a stretch of property that had been in litigation over environmental remediation for so long that no one went near it for any reason. Lucien had quietly acquired an interest in the company holding the litigation 5 years ago. It had seemed at the time like a minor financial position. It hadn't been a financial position. Dante had been to the mill once, when he was 17, the night his father had met with a rival faction to negotiate a territory line. He remembered the smell of old metal and rain coming through the roof, the catwalks overhead, the way sound moved strangely in the large space, echoing from unexpected angles, disappearing in others. He remembered his father walking out of that meeting looking older than he'd gone in. He turned the car toward the waterfront. He was 6 minutes out when Torres called again. "The East facility is gone," Torres said. His voice had the flat quality of a man reporting something he still didn't fully believe. "Both warehouses, total loss. Fire department's on scene, but there's nothing to save." "Anyone hurt?" "No. It's like it was time to go when the shift changed. Nobody inside." Lucian hadn't wanted casualties. That was information. It meant he was trying to keep this surgical, a transfer of power, not a war. He wanted the records gone. He wanted Dante's operational capacity cut. He wanted Sloan as leverage, but he wasn't trying to leave bodies that would bring the kind of attention that couldn't be managed. That was a constraint. Constraints were useful. "Torres," Dante said, "how many of your men are actually yours?" A silence that lasted exactly long enough to tell Dante that Torres had been thinking about this already. 8, I'm certain of, maybe 3 more. Keep them close and offline. No calls on the regular channels. If Lucian contacts you directly, you didn't hear from me. Dante. I know, just do it. He ended the call. The steel mill looked worse in daylight than he remembered. The perimeter fence had sections of missing chain link that someone had repaired with wire and not much else, and the parking area was weeds and old asphalt cracked into fragments. Rain had come through the broken sections of roof and pooled on the concrete floor, visible through the gap in the main entrance doors, which were chained but not padlocked. Dante sat in the car at the far end of the lot and looked at the building for 3 minutes. There were 2 black vehicles parked at the side entrance. He counted them twice. 2 vehicles, which meant at minimum 4 men, probably 6. He had his own weapon, which he'd retrieved from the holster in the living room before leaving the house this morning. But 6 to 1 in an unfamiliar building was not a confrontation. It was a surrender with extra steps. He needed a different way in. He also needed to know for certain she was inside before he did anything that couldn't be undone. He drove around the block and approached from the north side, where the fence had a longer gap covered by what looked like construction wrap that had been there so long it had partially fused to the chain link. He got out, left his jacket in the car, and moved along the fence line until he found the gap. He went through. The north wall of the mill had a row of ground-level windows, most of them boarded, 2 of them not. He went to the first unboarded one and looked in. The interior was vast, and his eyes needed a moment to adjust from the flat gray daylight to the deeper shadow inside. Structural columns rose to the ceiling 20 feet up. The catwalks were rusted but intact, the kind of built-to-last industrial metalwork that outlives everything it was built to serve. On the far side of the floor, near what had been the main processing area, he could see 2 men standing with the particular stillness of people who had been told to stand there and wait. He moved to the second window. Sloan was sitting on a metal chair in the middle of the floor, roughly 60 feet in. Her hands were behind her, which meant zip ties or rope. She was wearing what she'd had on when she left the house. The dark jacket, the gray blouse, and her hair had come partly loose from whatever she'd had it in. And she was sitting with her back straight and her chin level, and the expression on her face was the expression he'd seen from her exactly twice before. Once when a freight broker had tried to renegotiate a contract by threatening her personally, and once when a city inspector had implied at a compliance meeting that her analysis of a port contract was probably above her understanding. It was the expression of someone who was not afraid and was also not pretending not to be afraid. It was something more precise than either. It was contained fury, the kind that had nowhere to go yet and was therefore being held with both hands. He felt, looking at her through that dirty window, something he hadn't felt clearly in years. Not the version of it that had calcified into assumption and entitlement, but the original thing. The first night at the diner thing, the she is something I didn't know was possible thing. He needed to get her out. He also didn't have enough men to do it directly. He went back to the car and called Harwell. "Change of plan on the archive," he said. "I need you to make a different call first." Valeria arrived at the mill at 11:42. Dante watched from the north side as her car pulled into the side lot, and she got out with the purposeful walk of someone who had a reason to be moving quickly. She was carrying something, a laptop bag, or something similarly sized. He couldn't see her face clearly from this angle, but he'd watched her walk across his living room enough times to recognize it. He'd also, in the last 2 hours, started thinking very clearly about Valeria. She'd positioned herself as Lucien's operative, which the photograph in Sloane's archive confirmed. She'd positioned herself with Dante as a political fixer, which was her professional identity, verifiable, legitimate enough to get through his security without question. She'd played both angles for 16 months with what he now understood was considerable skill. What he hadn't fully thought through until this morning, sitting in his car outside a condemned steel mill, was that a person who could run 2 angles simultaneously for 16 months didn't only have 2 angles. He'd seen the client list in Sloane's archive. He'd seen 3 names on that list that he recognized as rival organizations. What he hadn't had time to fully process was a 4th name, one he'd passed over because it hadn't meant anything to him in the context of organized crime. It meant something to him now. The Berenson Group was a political consulting firm. It had offices in 4 cities and handled crisis management for public figures, institutional clients, and, according to its publicly available client list, 3 foundations with government contracts. It was exactly the kind of legitimate entity that a political fixer like Valeria would have connections to. It was also, as Dante had realized 40 minutes ago when he made a single call to a man who tracked these things, the organization that held the legal entity currently in possession of the Calderon steel mill litigation. Valeria hadn't just been Lucien's operative. She'd been the architecture, the whole thing. The introduction through Lucien's contact, the access she'd built to Dante's household, the distraction she'd provided while Lucien restructured the operational channels. It ran through the Berenson Group, which meant there was a third party. Someone above Lucien, above Valeria, who had a stake in the outcome of whatever was being built here. He didn't know yet who that was, but he knew Valeria did. He called Harwell again. He talked for 4 minutes. Harwell was quiet throughout, and at the end he said, "That's going to cost you things you can't get back." "I know," Dante said. "Are you certain?" He looked at the mill. He thought about Sloane sitting in a metal chair with her hands behind her back and the expression on her face that was held fury and nothing else. "Do it," he said. Inside the mill, Sloane had been counting exits for 2 hours. It was something she did automatically in unfamiliar spaces. A habit built over 15 years of operating in environments where the difference between a good outcome and a bad one was often as simple as knowing which direction to move in the dark. She'd identified the main doors, the side entrance, 3 ground-level windows on the south wall, and the stairwell access to the catwalks. She'd also identified, in the first 20 minutes, that the man directly behind her shifted his weight to his left leg every 4 to 5 minutes, which meant his right knee was bothering him, which meant his mobility was reduced. She'd also found, working her wrists against the zip ties for 90 minutes, that whoever had applied them had done it with their thumbs instead of bracing with a knee, which meant there was approximately 4 millimeters of give if she angled her hands correctly. She wasn't free yet. But she wasn't stuck either. The harder problem was the wire. When they'd brought her in, she'd noticed immediately that the mill's old internal security system, analog, probably installed in the 80s, abandoned but not removed, still had junction boxes on the main columns. The wiring was dead, or should have been, but the conduit ran to a breaker panel on the east wall that still had its connections to an external line, which meant that if the external line was still active from the litigation company's occasional site inspections, the system might not be as dead as it looked. She needed to get to that panel. She needed her hands free first. Valeria walked in at what felt like midday, though Sloane's phone had been taken, so she was working on internal time. She came in through the side door, crossed the floor with the laptop bag, and stopped in front of Sloane with the expression of someone visiting a problem they'd managed and were now checking on. "You look better than I expected," Valeria said. "You look exactly like I expected," Sloane said. Valeria tilted her head slightly. It was a practice gesture, acknowledging without conceding. "Where's the real ledger?" Valeria said. "Not the one in Dante's safe, the one you built." Sloane looked at her. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sloane." Valeria's voice was patient in a way that meant the patience was itself a pressure tactic. "We pulled your archive this morning. Your assistant, Priya, very loyal, by the way. She didn't give us anything voluntarily, but we were thorough. We have the client files. We have the surveillance documentation. We know what you know about the Meridian channel, and we know about the photograph. Something moved through Sloane's chest. Not fear, something adjacent to it. The kind of thing that tells you the situation has changed shape and you need to recalculate. Then you have everything, Sloane said. We have your copies of things we already control. What we don't have is the transmission record. Valeria crouched down slightly, bringing her face closer to Sloane's level. You transmitted something before we picked you up. We know that because the parking garage security system at your building showed your phone active for 11 minutes before you were approached. 11 minutes is a long time to transmit something. Sloane said nothing. Who did you send it to? Valeria said. I was answering an email from a client in Rotterdam. At 7 in the morning from a parking garage. I work early. Valeria straightened. She was quiet for a moment, and Sloane watched her recalibrate. She was good at it. The recalibration, it happened fast and left no visible residue. That was the thing about Valeria that Sloane had identified from the first time she'd seen a photograph of her, 14 months ago, when she'd started building the internal file. She was genuinely intelligent. Not the performed kind. Not the kind that needed an audience. The functional kind. The kind that processed information quickly and without sentiment. Sloane had spent 14 months being careful about that. Here's the problem, Valeria said. She set the laptop bag on a nearby crate and unzipped it. Lucian's timetable has 6 hours of margin. In 6 hours, the Viscari organization's operational records transfer to a new holding structure. The Meridian channel closes permanently, and the documentation we've prepared for federal investigators becomes available. After that, it doesn't matter what you transmitted or to whom, because the structure is complete and Dante can't touch it. She pulled a tablet from the bag. But if you transmitted the Meridian records to the right people before 6 hours is up, there's a chance, not a large one, but real, that someone moves fast enough to freeze the transfer. She turned the tablet to face Sloane. On the screen was a financial diagram, clean and complex. So I need to know who you sent it to, and I need to know in the next hour. Sloane looked at the diagram. She looked at Valeria. I want to ask you something, Sloane said. Valeria waited. The Berenson Group, Sloane said. How long have they been running you? The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Sloane counted them. Valeria's expression didn't collapse. It didn't even crack exactly. But something behind it shifted. A very small movement, like a building settling. And Sloane understood from that 4-second silence and that small shift that she had just detonated something she'd been carrying for 14 months. That name, Valeria said carefully, isn't in any of your files. No, Sloane agreed. It's not. She watched Valeria process that. Then how? Valeria said. Because you don't put everything in files. Sloane kept her voice level. You found the internal folder. That's the folder I built to document what I knew. There's a second set of documentation, not physical, not digital, not stored anywhere you can pull, that documents what I suspected but couldn't prove. The Berenson connection was in the suspected column, until about 30 seconds ago. The room felt different now. Both of the guards had gone still in the particular way of people who understand that the dynamic in front of them has shifted without being sure how. Valeria set the tablet down. Who are you transmitting for, Sut? She said. Her voice had changed, but the patient pressure tactic was gone. This was something rawer. Dante, you walked out on Dante last night. I'm not transmitting for anyone, Sloane said. I'm transmitting as myself. I have clients who pay me to provide intelligence and risk analysis. Some of those clients have interests that are directly affected by what Lucian is building. They contracted me for exactly this kind of situation 14 months ago, before I knew specifically what I was looking at. By the time I knew, the contract was already in place. She let that sit. Which means, Sloane continued, that the people who have what I sent them this morning are not Dante's people. They're not connected to the organization at all. They're connected to the clients who will be most damaged by the Berenson Group completing what it started, and they have both the resources and the motivation to move in the next 6 hours. Valeria picked up her phone. She walked to the far side of the floor, putting distance between herself and Sloane, and made a call. Sloane couldn't hear the words. She could see Valeria's back, the set of her shoulders, The one moment when the hand not holding the phone went flat against her own thigh, in a gesture Sloane recognized as someone pressing down on their own reaction. The call lasted 2 minutes. When Valeria turned around, she was composed again, but the composition was effort now. Sloane could see the effort. "Lucian needs the name of your contact," Valeria said. "Now, not in an hour." "I don't respond well to timetables," Sloane said. Valeria crossed the floor in 8 steps and stopped directly in front of her. This close, Sloane could see that her composure was doing real work, that underneath it something had gone genuinely wrong in the last 2 minutes, something the phone call had confirmed. "Do you understand what happens to you if this goes sideways?" Valeria said. It came out lower than her usual register, and for the first time it didn't sound like management. It sounded personal. "I understand it better than you do," Sloane said, "because I've been running the scenarios for 14 months, and you've been running them for 30 seconds. Valeria stepped back. She turned away. She made another call. Sloane worked her wrists against the zip tie. Dante got the call from Harwell at 12:18. "The federal contact is in," Harwell said. "They want the transmission record and proof of the Meridian channel before they'll move. They'll have it." "Dante." Harwell paused. "They're going to want the organization's full financial architecture in exchange for the cooperation agreement. Not the last 5 years, all of it." Dante was standing at the north wall of the mill, back against the brick, watching the side entrance. "I know." "That's everything. 20 years of, I know what it is, Harwell. You'll have nothing left." Dante thought about that. He thought about the east warehouses burning, smoke visible from 3 blocks away. He thought about Lucian's face saying, "I've been planning this for 14 months. He thought about Sloane's voice on the phone, controlled, furious, not frightened, saying, "Don't do anything stupid." He thought about a diner at 1 in the morning, and a girl who sat down across from him and showed him what he was missing, and the 15 years he'd spent treating that gift like it was owed to him. "Set up the meeting," he said. He ended the call. He had 4 of Torres's men outside the mill now. He'd had Torres send them quietly, one at a time, over the last hour. Not enough to take the building directly, not with the 6 inside plus Valeria, but enough to control the exits if the situation changed shape. He needed the situation to change shape. He called Torres. "Tell your men to stay put. Nobody moves until I say." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to walk in the front door." Torres said something that was not entirely words and contained the specific energy of a man who believes he is watching someone make a catastrophic mistake. Dante appreciated it and ended the call anyway. He walked around to the main entrance. The chains on the main doors weren't padlocked. He'd confirmed that from the first look. He unwound the chain, set it on the ground, and pushed the left door open. The sound it made, heavy metal on concrete, moved through the entire building. He walked in with his hands visible at his sides. There were 2 men near the entrance who had their weapons up before he'd taken 3 steps, and he stopped and looked at them and said, "I need to see my wife," in the tone he used when he needed people to understand that the question of whether they'd comply was already settled. The men looked at each other. Neither of them was Lucian's inner circle. They were contractors, hired for the operation, which meant they hadn't been given instructions that covered this specific scenario. He walked past them. He crossed the floor and saw her. She looked at him with an expression that contained, in roughly equal measure, exasperation and something that was not relief but was in the same neighborhood. "I told you not to do anything stupid," she said. "I haven't done anything stupid yet." Walking into a building with 6 armed men counts. "I brought friends." He looked at her hands behind her back. He looked at the guards. 4 of them now, plus Valeria, who had stopped at the far side of the floor when she heard the door and was now watching him with the expression of someone running calculations fast. "Is she hurt?" he said to the room, not to anyone specifically. "She's fine," Valeria said. She crossed the floor toward him. "You shouldn't be here." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "The Berenson group knows I'm here. I called them 20 minutes ago." Valeria stopped. "Their New York office," Dante said. "I spoke with a man named Carver. He seemed interested in my offer." The color didn't leave Valeria's face. She was too controlled for that. But her stillness changed quality, became something less like composure, and more like someone who has just heard a sound they can't immediately identify and has stopped moving while they determine what it was. "You don't have anything to offer, Berenson," she said. By tonight, my cooperation agreement with federal investigators is filed and the Meridian Channel is frozen pending seizure." He watched her. "Which makes whatever Berenson was going to build on top of Lucian's restructure worthless. Because the assets it was meant to launder through don't exist in clean form anymore. I've made sure of that." "You'd burn your own organization?" "I already burned it, about an hour ago." He looked at her. "The man the Berenson Group is backing doesn't have a foundation to build on anymore, which makes Valeria Knox a liability instead of an asset. And I thought Carver should know that before he committed anything further." The silence in the building was the kind that comes from everyone in a room recalculating simultaneously. "You're bluffing," Valeria said, but she said it one beat too late. "Call Carver," Dante said. "Right now, ask him." She looked at him. She looked at her phone. She did not make the call. What she did, and Dante saw it, registered it, understood in the instant before it happened that he hadn't fully accounted for this variable, was reach into the laptop bag and pull out the tablet and hold it up so he could see the screen. "Here's what you don't know," she said. Her voice had gone to something cold and very clear. "We pulled the Mercer Blackstone archive this morning, all of it, including the internal folder." She swiped on the tablet. "Including documentation of every client Sloan has worked with in the last 14 months. Including 3 clients whose names your federal contact would find very interesting. Clients who are not Lucian. Clients who are not you." She turned the tablet so Sloan could see it too. "If the cooperation agreement gets filed," Valeria said, "we file a parallel disclosure. And the clients who hired Sloan to document the Meridian Channel, who are themselves not clean, who hired her specifically because they needed intelligence on a rival criminal operation, they go down with everything else." Dante looked at Sloan. Sloan was looking at the tablet. "Those clients," she said, and her voice had something in it that Dante had not heard before. Something tight and careful, in a way that told him this had landed somewhere real, "are under an expectation of confidentiality." "Which I'm sure is very important to them," Valeria said. Dante looked at Sloan's face. He looked at the tablet. He thought about the client list he'd seen in the archive, and the 3 rival organization names he'd noted, and the 4th name, the Berenson Group, that he'd followed up on. And then he thought about which clients would have the most to lose from a federal disclosure, and he thought about what kind of clients might, if exposed, respond in ways that were not legal. "They'll come after her," he said. It came out quiet. "That depends entirely," Valeria said, "on whether any disclosure happens." She set the tablet down. She looked at Dante with the expression of someone who has finally gotten to the part of the conversation they were building toward all along. "Call off the federal agreement," she said. "Both of you step back. Let the next 6 hours complete. Lucian takes the organizational structure. You keep your legitimate holdings. Sloan keeps her company and her client list clean. Everyone walks away from tonight with something." The mill was very quiet. Dante looked at Sloan. She was looking at him with the expression he remembered from the first night, from the diner, from the very first time she'd showed him something he hadn't known was there, but the version of it on her face right now was older and harder and carrying 15 years of additional weight. "Don't," she said. It came out low. "Sloan, don't you dare trade this away." Her voice was still controlled, but barely, and the barely was something he hadn't heard from her before. "Don't you dare do that. I built 14 months of documentation. I transmitted it this morning. Whatever happens next, don't you hand this back to them. They'll go after your clients. Let them." Her jaw was tight. "I knew the risk when I took those contracts. I knew what I was doing. You didn't know because I didn't tell you, and I didn't tell you because it wasn't your decision to make." He looked at her. "It was never your decision to make," she said. Quieter now. Like something she'd been holding for a long time that had finally run out of room. "None of it was. Not 14 months ago, and not tonight. Stop making decisions for things that belong to me." The zip tie on her wrist gave. She'd been working it the whole time, through Valeria's interrogation, through Dante's entrance, through all of it. And it gave now, finally, with a small sound that only she felt, her hands coming free behind her back. And she kept them there because the moment hadn't arrived yet, but it was close. Dante was looking at Valeria. He was thinking she could see it. The same expression he'd had in the diner booth, calculation running fast behind his eyes. But this time, for the first time in a long time, she didn't know which way it was going to land. "Here's my answer," Dante said to Valeria. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He held it up. On the screen was a text notification, time-stamped 7 minutes ago, from a contact labeled only as H. It read, "Filed. Effective immediately." Valeria looked at the screen. She looked at Dante. "The agreement was filed before I walked in here," he said. "I wasn't negotiating. I was giving you a chance to walk away from whatever Lucian promised you before the frame closes." Valeria's composure finally broke. Not dramatically. It wasn't a collapse. It was more like a structure losing the last supporting element and going from standing to not standing in one quiet instant. She looked at the phone, and then at the tablet, and then at something that wasn't in the room at all. The guards were looking at each other. Torres's men came through the doors. And in the moment when everyone's attention went to the entrances, Sloane stood up from the metal chair, crossed 8 feet of concrete floor to the east wall, reached the breaker panel, and pulled the main switch. The mill went dark. Not completely. There was gray light from the broken roof sections. But the interior dropped from dim to close to black in an instant, and the catwalks above rattled as something shifted in the sudden absence of the ambient electrical hum that had been running the whole time. A hum so constant it had become invisible until it stopped. Sloane's hand found the conduit she'd been tracking since she arrived. She pulled the wire. She felt for the junction she'd identified from her chair 2 hours ago. Her fingers were shaking slightly for the first time all day, but they were shaking while still moving. From the darkness came Valeria's voice, sharp and losing its shape. "Find her!" From a different direction came Dante's voice, lower, moving. "Sloane." And from somewhere above, on the catwalks, the sound of a single pair of footsteps that didn't belong to anyone who'd come in through the doors. Lucian had been in the building the whole time. Sloane's hand stopped on the wire. She had 4 seconds, maybe 5, before someone found her. She thought about what she had: the conduit, the junction, the active external line she'd confirmed through 30 minutes of careful observation before anyone had bothered to look at what she was doing. She thought about the surveillance system she'd noticed the moment they'd brought her in. Analog, abandoned. But the junction boxes had been on the columns for 40 years, and the wiring ran to a transmitter that had last been registered to a monitoring company that still, technically, had an active account. She made the connection. Somewhere outside the mill, a signal that hadn't moved in 11 years woke up and began transmitting to a monitoring system that, by its own records, should have been servicing this location. She didn't know if anyone was listening. She had done everything she could do from where she was standing. Now she needed light, or at least darkness she understood better than everyone else in the room, and she moved along the east wall toward the stairwell she'd been calculating since she arrived. Her shoulder brushing brick, her feet quiet on the wet concrete, while above her on the catwalks, Lucien Vescari moved toward the only exit that wasn't covered. The stairwell door was cold under Sloane's palm. She found it by memory. Not actual memory, she'd never been in this building before yesterday, but the architectural memory she'd built in 2 hours of sitting still and looking. The door was 12 feet from the east wall junction box, set back 18 inches into a concrete alcove that smelled like rust and old water. Her shoulder hit the alcove edge before her hand found the door handle, and the impact sent a jolt up her arm that she absorbed without making a sound. She pulled the door open and went in. The stairwell was darker than the main floor. No broken roof sections here, no gray daylight coming from anywhere. She put her right hand on the railing, which was cold and slightly tacky with old grease, and she started climbing. The stairs were metal grating, the kind that makes noise when you step on the outer edge. So she stepped on the inner edge close to the wall, where the bolts took the weight more directly and the flex was less. She counted steps. 12 to the first landing, another 12 to the second level. On the main floor below her, she could hear the sound of the situation coming apart. Voices, movement, Torres's men, and Lucian's contractors finding each other in the dark. The particular quality of noise that a contained space makes when multiple groups of people are all trying to be quiet simultaneously and failing. One brief commotion near the main entrance, something knocked over, someone swearing in a low, urgent voice. She reached the second-level catwalk and stopped. The catwalk ran the length of the building's east side, maybe 90 feet, with a cross catwalk connecting to the west side at the midpoint. The grading here was older, and she could feel the slight give in it with every step. Not structural failure, just age, the metal having learned to flex rather than break. She moved carefully, one hand on the railing, testing each section before she committed her weight. She was looking for Lucian. This was the part she hadn't fully planned, because she hadn't known Lucian was in the building when she'd made her calculation at the breaker panel. She'd known there were guards, she'd known Valeria was present, and she'd known that Dante's arrival had changed the balance of forces on the main floor in a way that gave her an opening. She hadn't known that the footsteps she'd heard on the catwalk during Dante's confrontation with Valeria belonged to a man who'd been up here watching the whole time, staying out of the main action until the moment required him to move. She was 30 feet along the east catwalk when she heard him. He was on the cross catwalk, moving toward the west stairwell, the exit that Torres's men hadn't covered because they'd come in from the north and east. He was moving quickly, but not running, the pace of a man executing a planned withdrawal rather than fleeing in panic. And that told her something important. He had somewhere specific to go. The ledger. Valeria had mentioned the real ledger, the Vescari organization's encrypted records, which were the foundation of everything Lucian had built his restructuring plan on. If Dante's federal agreement had frozen the organizational assets, the ledger was the one piece Lucian needed to get out of the building with. Sloane started moving faster. She was on the cross catwalk before she'd fully decided to be, her feet finding the grating by instinct, the railing vibrating slightly under her grip. The cross catwalk swayed, not dangerously, but noticeably, the way a suspension bridge moves to distribute load, and for one step she felt the entire structure's age in her palms. Lucian heard her. He stopped. She stopped. In the gray half-light filtering from the roof sections 40 feet up, she could see his silhouette, large, still, a man who had been in difficult rooms for 50 years and did not scare easily. He was at the far end of the cross catwalk, maybe 40 feet away, and there was something in his right hand that was not a weapon. Rectangular, flat. The ledger was in a case. She was looking at the case. "Sloane," he said. His voice, even now, had the uncle quality. The steadiness of it was almost more unsettling than anger would have been. She didn't say anything. She was calculating the catwalk, 40 feet between them, single width, railing on both sides, no room to go around. "You should go back down," he said. "Whatever Dante's doing with the Federals, it doesn't change anything for you. You're not part of the organization. You've never been charged with anything. Walk away from tonight and your company survives." "My company survives either way," she said. "Not if Valeria files the parallel disclosure." "Valeria's not going to file anything." Sloane started walking toward him. Slow, steady, one hand still on the railing. "Because the client she was threatening to expose hired me to document this operation specifically so that they'd have leverage in exactly this scenario. If she files, they respond, and what they respond with is considerably more damaging to the Berenson Group than anything in my client files." She was 30 feet away now. Lucian hadn't moved. He was watching her the way you watch something you haven't fully categorized yet. "You've been building a counter to every piece of this," he said. It wasn't quite admiration. It was something more like the specific frustration of a chess player who realizes, too late, that the board looked different than they thought. 14 months, she said. Dante didn't know. No. You did this without him. I did it instead of him. She was 20 feet away. Because he wasn't looking. Lucian's jaw moved. Something shifted in his face. Not guilt. She didn't think Lucian did guilt in the standard way, but something adjacent to respect that had a bitter edge to it. He should have, Lucian started. Don't. She stopped 15 feet away. Don't tell me what Dante should have done. I've had 15 years of knowing what he should have done. I don't need it from you. I was going to say he should have been afraid of you. Lucian's voice had gone quiet. I was. From the beginning, I was afraid of you. I told him that. He said you were his. The word landed in the space between them like something dropped from the catwalk above. I know, she said. Give me the exit and keep the company, he said. Clean split. I walk out with the ledger. The federal case proceeds against the organizational structure, which is already gone anyway. And you are completely removed from anything that follows. Your clients are protected. Dante gets his cooperation deal. I disappear. He extended the case slightly, not offering it, just making it visible. Or you stop me here and we see what happens in a building with no lights, 6 men with guns, and a federal investigation that's going to pull everyone into its mouth regardless. Sloane looked at the case. She thought about the transmitter signal she'd sent from the breaker panel junction. She didn't know if anyone was listening. She didn't know if the monitoring company's account was active enough to route an alert to anyone who would respond in time. She had done what she could do from where she was standing, and the rest was probability. She thought about Dante's voice in the dark below saying her name. She thought about what Lucian had just said. He should have been afraid of you. And the thing it cracked open in her chest was not warmth. It was something older and colder, the particular grief of being seen clearly by the wrong person at the wrong time. No, she said. Lucian looked at her. No to which part? All of it. She stepped forward. Below on the main floor, Dante was moving through the dark by sound. He'd lost visual on everything when the lights went, but he'd spent the first 3 seconds of darkness doing the only useful thing available, standing completely still and listening. He heard the contractors, 4 of them, repositioning, and Torres's 3 men coming in from the east entrance, and Valeria's voice from the far side of the floor, high and directing, telling someone to find the main switch. He heard the stairwell door open and close, which told him Sloane had made it. He moved toward the sound of Valeria. He wasn't going for her directly. He was triangulating. She was near the crate where she'd set the laptop bag, which meant she was near the original processing area, which meant she was 20 feet from the steel mill's manual control panel. He didn't know if the control system still had power after Sloane had hit the breaker, but he knew from walking in that the panel was there, because Sloane would have identified it the moment she arrived, and if it had been useful to her, she would have noted it. She'd moved to the breaker, not the panel, which meant the panel wasn't electrical, which meant it was mechanical. He found the panel by running his hand along the south wall until he hit the housing, a metal box approximately the size of a refrigerator, mounted into the wall, its handles cold under his palm. He felt along the surface until he found the primary lever. Industrial mills of this era used mechanical systems for the overhead crane rails and the partition barriers, heavy steel sections that divided the workspace for safety during processing. If the mechanical system was still functional, there were 2 partition barriers in this building, and he'd seen them on his way in, massive steel panels retracted into the wall housings that could be extended across sections of the floor. He pulled the lever. The sound it made was enormous, a grinding, mechanical roar that had nothing to do with electricity, driven by counterweights and compressed air that had been sitting in the system for 11 years. From somewhere above, a deep clunk of a lock disengaging. And then, slowly, with a sound like something waking up from a long time underground, the east partition barrier began to move. It extended from the wall housing in sections, each one sliding into the next with a heavy impact, and the sound of it filled the building completely, covered every other sound, every voice, every footstep, for approximately 8 seconds. When it stopped, the floor was divided. Valeria and 3 of Lucian's contractors were on the far side of the barrier. Torres's men were on Dante's side. "Torres," Dante said, loudly enough to be heard in the new quiet after the barrier. "East wall. Move up." He heard Torres's men shift. He moved with them toward the base of the east stairwell, because that was where Sloane had gone. On the catwalk, Lucian moved first. He came forward fast, faster than she'd expected from a man his size, and his left hand grabbed the railing while his right kept the case, and he was trying to get past her, not through her. She sidestepped into his path, which was a mistake, because his shoulder caught her in the chest, and the impact drove the air out of her in a single hard compression and sent her into the opposite railing with enough force that the catwalk shook. She grabbed the railing with both hands. Her ribs screamed. She held on. Lucian had stopped 3 feet past her. He'd felt the catwalk move, felt the whole section flex under the impact. And he was a careful man, and the catwalk was old, and he stopped. She pulled herself upright. Her chest felt like something in it was broken or close to it. She breathed through it carefully. "Move," Lucian said. He wasn't looking at her now. He was looking at the catwalk section between them, assessing. No, she said again. Her voice came out thinner than she wanted it to. Below them, the barrier mechanism had fired. She'd felt it through the catwalk structure, the building-level vibration of something massive moving. And now there were voices below, movement, the situation on the main floor changing in ways she couldn't fully see. Lucian looked down through the grating. Then he looked at her. "If I have to go through you," he said, and he stopped, and she understood that he was telling her something real. Not a threat exactly, more like a fact he wished were different. "I know," she said. "Do it anyway, and see what's on the other side." She set her feet on the grating. He came at her properly this time, both hands free, the case tucked under his left arm, his right hand reaching for her jacket. She ducked left, which was the direction she'd been planning since he first moved, and grabbed his right wrist with both hands and used his own forward momentum to redirect him into the railing. The railing took his weight with a sound that was too close to structural complaint for comfort. The case slipped from under his arm. It fell. Not far, 8 feet to the lower catwalk section, where it landed with a flat impact and slid 6 inches and stopped against a railing post. They both looked at it. Then Lucian hit her. It was a controlled strike, not wild, not rage, the kind of hit that a man delivers when he's trying to put someone down efficiently rather than hurt them. An open palm to the side of her head that made the world go sideways for 2 seconds and put her on one knee on the grating. The grating pressed into her knee through the fabric of her trousers, and she felt every edge of every hole in it, and her hand found the railing below the top rail, and she held on and breathed. "Stay there," Lucian said. He was already moving toward the section of catwalk that connected to the lower level. She got up. She didn't know exactly why. There was no tactical reason. He was past her now. The case was below. The situation had passed the point where her physical intervention was the relevant factor. She got up because the alternative was staying on the grating, and staying on the grating was not something she was going to do. Her legs were less steady than she needed them to be. She moved along the cross catwalk toward the connecting section, one hand on the railing, her head clearing unevenly, the world coming back into focus in stages the way it does after an impact. Below her, through the grating, she could see the main floor. Dante was at the base of the east stairwell, looking up. 3 of Torres's men were fanned out behind him. He saw her, yet she could tell by the way he went still, and she saw him do the specific calculation she'd seen him do 100 times, the assessment, the response matrix. "Lucian's coming down," she said. Her voice carried in the steel building better than she expected. Dante moved. Lucian came off the connecting section at the lower level, moving fast, and turned toward the west stairwell, and Dante was already there. They'd known each other for 47 years. Dante had spent most of those years looking at Lucian as fixed. The older cousin, the steady one, the man who had been there when their world collapsed and had helped him build it back. He'd built his understanding of loyalty partly on Lucian, on the specific texture of what Lucian's presence in his life felt like. And now he was standing in the dark of a steel mill looking at the man who had spent 14 months dismantling everything they'd built. And the feeling wasn't rage. It was colder than rage. It was the specific temperature of something permanent. "Give me the case," Dante said. Lucian looked at him. He looked behind him. There was no exit behind him, not without going through Dante. He looked at the case in his hand. He looked back at Dante. "It doesn't matter now," Lucian said. "The federal agreement's filed. The organizational structure is frozen. The case is... it's just records at this point. Evidence." "Then give it to me." "And what? You hand it over? Add it to your cooperation package?" Lucian's voice had lost the uncle quality completely now. What was underneath was something older and more exhausted. "You were never going to be what your father was. You know that. I've known it for 20 years. He built things with his hands. You built them with her mind and couldn't even say her name." Dante looked at him for a long moment. "I know," he said. Lucian blinked. "I know what I did," Dante said. "I know what I took. I know what I cost her, and I know what I cost myself. And I know exactly how much of what I called my empire was built on work I never credited and judgment I never acknowledged." His voice was steady. "And I know it doesn't fix anything to say it now, but you used that. You used every real failure I had, and you built a weapon out of it, and you aimed it at her, and that's the part I can't move past." "I aimed it at you," Lucian said. "You aimed it at her when you had her brought here." Dante stepped forward. Give me the case, Lucian. Or what? Or I let Torres's men handle it, and that's worse for both of us, and you know it. Lucian looked at the case. He set it on the lower catwalk railing. He stepped back. It wasn't surrender exactly. It was a man who had run his calculation and found the column of things worth fighting for had become shorter than the column of things already lost. Dante picked up the case. Above them, on the upper catwalk, Sloane was visible, one hand on the railing, watching. The side of her face was marked where Lucian had hit her, and Dante saw it, and his jaw tightened, and he stayed where he was because moving toward Lucian right now was not useful. The federal contact needs to be at this location, Dante said, not to Lucian, looking up at Sloane. I already sent them, she said. He looked at her. The transmitter at the breaker panel, she said. It wasn't just a signal. It routed through the monitoring system to an account I'd set up with the building's litigation company as part of the Berenson Group research. She paused. The account has a federal safety protocol attached to it, an active investigation flag. Any signal from this location triggers a mandatory response from the Economic Crimes Unit. Dante processed that. How long ago did you send it? He said. About 25 minutes. He did the math. Federal response time from the nearest field office to this location, accounting for the need to coordinate and confirm the signal. He looked at Torres, who was looking at his phone. 8 minutes, Torres said. 8 minutes. Dante looked at Lucian. Lucian was looking at nothing, his hands at his sides, the posture of a man who is doing the internal math and arriving at the same answer from every direction. Valeria, Dante said. Still on the other side of the barrier, Torres said. We've got the exits covered. She'll have her own exit plan. Dante looked at Torres. West exit, external route south. Torres moved. 2 of his men went with him. Dante looked back at Lucian. They stood 4 feet apart in the half-dark of the lower catwalk, while the sounds of the building shifted around them. Valeria somewhere on the other side of the partition barrier. Torres's men moving to the west exit. The distant sound of something on the main floor being knocked over. I'm not going to run, Lucian said. He said it like he was telling Dante something he'd decided recently. I know, Dante said. I want that noted. It's noted. The silence between them was the kind that exists between people who have known each other long enough that some conversations happen in it without words. 47 years, the kitchen table at his mother's apartment, the hospital waiting room after Dante's father died. 20 years of meetings and decisions, and the specific texture of a loyalty that had, somewhere in the last 14 months, become something else. Lucian sat down on the catwalk step. Dante stood. Valeria found the west exit. Torres found Valeria at the west exit. She had the door open and 1 foot across the threshold, and Torres was 6 feet behind her when she turned. She was carrying the laptop bag and the tablet, and she looked at Torres with the expression of someone running every remaining option simultaneously. The disclosure, she said. Already handled, Torres said. He didn't know the specifics, but he'd been listening to Dante's calls long enough to know how to sound like he did. She looked at him. Berenson Group's New York office has been contacted by Dante's attorney, Torres said, inventing nothing except the certainty in his voice. Whatever play you were going to make, they've already been told it's off the table. Valeria looked at the door behind her. The night air was coming through, cold, slightly damp, smelling of the waterfront. She took her foot back inside. The ledger, she said. Dante has it. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the composure was back, but it was thinner than it had been all day. Surface tension more than substance, the kind of composure that was doing exactly the work required to maintain itself and nothing more. I want a conversation with the federal contact, she said, before anyone is formally processed. That's not my call, Torres said. Whose call is it? Torres thought about it. Sloane Mercer's, he said. Valeria looked at the closed door. She looked at Torres. She set the laptop bag on the floor. All right, she said. Sloane came down from the catwalk slowly, one hand on the railing, the other pressed against her ribs where the impact with the railing had done the most damage. Not broken, she thought. Cracked, maybe. The pain was the precise localized kind that got worse when she breathed too deeply, which meant she was breathing shallowly, which was not ideal. She came off the stairwell onto the main floor and found the building had changed while she was above it. The partition barrier divided the space. Torres's men were at the exits. Lucian was sitting on the catwalk step. with the specific posture of a man done running, and Dante was standing at the base of the stairwell, watching her come down with his hands at his sides, and the expression that was not the damage control expression, and not the strategic expression, and not any of the expressions she'd spent 15 years cataloging. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "The side of your face," he said. "I know." "Lucian, it's fine." It wasn't fine exactly, but it was the kind of not fine she could manage. She looked past him at Lucian on the step. Then she looked at the case in Dante's hand. "The real ledger," she said. "Yes. Give it to me." He looked at her. He looked at the case. He held it out. She took it. It was heavier than she expected, or her arms were more tired than she'd registered. She held it with both hands. "The federal contact," she said. "When they arrive, this goes directly to them with a full accounting of what it contains and where it came from, not through the cooperation agreement, not through your attorney." She looked at Dante. "Independently. From me. Sloan. Independently." Her voice came out steady, which cost her something she'd have to account for later. "My name on it. My documentation. My transmission from this morning as the evidentiary basis. Not connected to any organization, not connected to your cooperation deal, not connected to anything except Mercer Blackstone and 14 months of work." He looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. It came out quiet. "I need you to understand what that means," she said. "It means when this is done, there's no version of it where you get credit for any part of what happens tonight. I know. I need to hear you say you know." "Sloan." His voice was different. It had the rough honesty in it that she'd last heard from him, really heard from it, somewhere around year 3. "I know. Whatever happens after tonight, the federal case, the outcome, whatever gets written about this, you built 14 months of the reason any of it works. I know that. I've known it since this morning when I found the internal folder. And I know that me knowing it now, too late, is not—" He stopped. He reset. "It's not what you needed, but I know it." She looked at him. The sirens were audible now. Still distant, but coming. The specific pitch of federal vehicles that moved through traffic differently than local ones. She looked at the case in her hands. She looked at Lucian on the catwalk step. She looked at the building around her, the broken roof, the gray light coming through in sections, the old steel of the walls that had stood through everything this city had done to the waterfront over 40 years. She looked at Dante. He was standing in the same building where his father had died. She'd known that, going through the files. She hadn't said it, and she wasn't going to say it now. But she could see it on him. The specific weight of a place that carries something, the way he stood slightly differently than he did in any other room she'd ever seen him in. "You need to be outside when they arrive," she said. "I know. Torres's men too. Leave Lucian where he is. Leave Valeria at the west exit. When the federal agents come through that door, the only person they see holding the ledger is me." He looked at the case one more time. Then he looked at her face. The side of it, where the mark from Lucian's hand was darkening, and his jaw moved once. "Dante." She said his name the way she'd used to say it, a long time ago, when it was just a word and not a history. "Go." He went. Torres went with him, and Torres's men followed, and the building went quieter than it had been since she'd arrived. She stood in the middle of the main floor of the Calderon steel mill, holding a case that contained 20 years of criminal financial records, listening to the sirens get closer. She breathed. Shallow, because of the ribs. Steady, because that was what was required. Somewhere outside the building, she heard the first vehicle stop, then the second, then doors. She straightened. She adjusted her grip on the case. Her hair was partly down. Her jacket was damaged at the left shoulder seam. The side of her face felt wrong in a way she wasn't fully addressing yet. And she was standing in an abandoned steel mill on the waterfront at what she estimated was close to 2 in the afternoon. She had transmitted her documentation at 7 this morning. She had spent 7 hours in a building being used as leverage. She had disabled a surveillance system, made a connection in the dark, cracked a zip tie that took 90 minutes to work through, walked a catwalk 40 feet off the floor, and held a position on a metal grating while a man 50 pounds heavier than her tried to get past. The doors opened. Light came in, real daylight, harsh and flat, and with it the shapes of people moving with purpose, and the first voice was official and controlled and asking for identification, and Sloane said her name clearly in the silence of the building. Sloane Mercer, Mercer Blackstone. And she held up the case. She said, "I have the ledger and 14 months of supporting documentation. I'd like to speak with whoever is running this operation." She stood in that light, in that building, with nothing behind her and everything ahead of her still to be decided, and she did not look toward the exit where Dante had gone. She had looked back enough times. The federal agent who ran the operation was a woman named Castillo. She was 51, gray at the temples, with the particular kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from having processed enough chaos that it no longer registers as extraordinary. She came through the main doors of the mill 2 steps ahead of her team, took in the space with one sweep, and walked directly to Sloane without stopping to assess the room further, which told Sloane something about what kind of agent she was. "Miss Mercer." Castillo stopped 3 feet away. She looked at the case. She looked at the side of Sloane's face. "Are you hurt?" "Cracked ribs, possibly. The facial injury is surface." Sloane held out the case. "The ledger is inside. It's been in my possession since approximately 1:15 this afternoon. Chain of custody is clean from that point. I can document the transfer." Castillo took the case. She didn't open it. "We'll need a full statement." "I have 14 months of documentation. I'll provide everything." Sloane paused. "I want one condition acknowledged before we begin." Castillo looked at her without expression. "My clients," Sloane said, "3 of them are named in the internal files I transmitted this morning. Their involvement with me was as contracted intelligence sources. They hired me to document criminal activity, not to participate in it. I want their cooperation status formalized before any disclosure of their identities." "That's not a condition I can agree to in a building." "I know. I want it on record that I'm requesting it." Castillo looked at her for a moment. "It's on record." Sloane nodded once. Behind Castillo, 2 agents were crossing the floor toward Lucian, who had remained on the catwalk step in exactly the position Dante had left him. He stood when they approached, stood slowly without being asked, the way a man stands when he has decided that a particular chapter is finished and the only remaining question is how he carries himself out of it. He put his hands out. The agents were professional about it, and he was professional about it, and the whole exchange had a quality of formality that Sloane found, watching it from across the floor, almost unbearably sad. She'd known Lucian for 12 years. Not well. He'd always kept a careful, pleasant distance from her, which she understood now as the distance of someone managing a long-term threat. But she'd known his laugh, his particular humor, the way he ordered food at restaurants as though he'd personally considered every option on the menu. The man being walked out of the Calderon steel mill in restraints was the same man who had once, at a family dinner, quietly moved her wine glass away from the edge of the table when she wasn't looking because he'd noticed it was too close and he hadn't wanted to embarrass her by pointing it out. She looked away. At the west exit, she could hear Valeria's voice, controlled and precise, negotiating, because that was what Valeria did in every situation. And even now, Sloane had to acknowledge, with the complicated respect one professional has for another, that the woman did not stop working. 2 more agents came in from the north entrance and went toward the west exit. Sloane stood in the middle of the floor. The adrenaline was leaving her body in the way it does, not all at once, but in stages, each stage revealing something that had been covered by it. The ribs made themselves known more fully. Her left hand was trembling slightly, which she noticed and addressed by closing it into a loose fist and holding it against her thigh. The side of her face had moved from impact numb into the beginning of real pain, and the back of her right shoulder, where she'd hit the railing on the catwalk, had stiffened in the way things stiffen when you've been running on cortisol and it stops covering them. She was 41 years old, and she was standing in an abandoned steel mill with cracked ribs and a damaged jacket, and nowhere specific to be until Castillo needed her statement. And she was, say, underneath all of it, underneath the pain and the exhaustion and the specific grief of watching Lucian walk out in restraints, she was all right. That was the thing she kept coming back to, the way she'd come back to it the night she left the mansion. She was all right, not unharmed, not without cost, not clean, but all right in the sense that mattered most, intact, in possession of herself, the same person who had walked into this building as the person standing in it now. She breathed shallowly and waited for Castillo. The statement took 4 hours. They did it at the field office, in a room with bad coffee and good recording equipment, and Castillo sat across from her with 2 other agents, and they went through everything: the timeline, the client contracts, the surveillance documentation, the transmission from the parking garage, the signal from the breaker panel junction, the chain of custody for the ledger. Sloan answered every question directly and completely, and when she didn't know something, she said so, and when she needed to check a specific date against her documentation, she said so, and the 4 hours were the most exhaustively honest she'd been in a professional context in a long time. At one point, Castillo asked, "When did you first identify Lucian Viscari as the principal threat actor?" Sloan thought about it. Definitively, 14 months ago. Suspicion? Probably 2 years ago. But I didn't have evidence that distinguished internal corruption from general organizational looseness until I started specifically looking. Why didn't you bring this to federal authorities when you first suspected it? Sloan looked at her. Because my husband was the head of the organization. Castillo held her gaze without blinking. And now? Now he's cooperating with your office through his own counsel. She paused. And I'm his wife in name only for however long it takes to formalize the rest. Castillo wrote something. The cooperation agreement he filed this morning, were you aware of it before it was filed? No. Did you advise him to file it? No. She thought about Dante's voice in the car, calling her 4 times before noon, and about the text on his phone from Harwell that she'd seen him hold up to Valeria in the mill. He made that decision himself, as far as I know. Castillo looked at her notes. As far as you know. As far as I know, Sloan said. I don't have full visibility into his decisions. I haven't for some time. There was a pause. Castillo looked up, and in the specific quality of that look, not judgment, not suspicion, something closer to recognition, Sloan understood that Castillo had been doing this long enough to hear the weight in that sentence and was choosing not to pull on it, and that this was a form of professional courtesy. Thank you, Sloan said. She wasn't sure exactly what she was thanking her for. Castillo nodded once, which suggested she knew. They released her at 8:15 in the evening. Priya was waiting in the lobby. She'd been contacted. Sloan didn't know by whom, though she suspected Torres, and she'd brought a change of clothes in a bag and a coffee from the place on Mercer Street that stayed open until 10, and when Sloan came through the security door into the lobby, Priya looked at the side of her face, and her jaw tightened, and she didn't say anything. Don't, Sloan said. I wasn't going to. You were going to apologize for not stopping them at the office. I was going to say you look terrible, and that's a medical-grade observation, not an opinion. Sloan almost smiled. It pulled at the side of her face that hurt. There's a hospital 2 blocks east. I know. I already checked the wait time. It's 20 minutes. Priya handed her the coffee. They pulled the archive. I know. They were thorough. I know. Sloan took the coffee with both hands. Her hands had stopped trembling in the last hour, during the statement, when she'd had something to focus on. What did they take? Physical files. They missed the off-site digital copies because those are registered under the Rotterdam client's account structure, not Mercer Blackstone directly. Priya paused. You did that on purpose. 14 months ago, yes. Priya was quiet for a moment. The Rotterdam client called while you were in the statement. They've been informed of the situation. They're not withdrawing. Sloan looked at the coffee cup. She held it for a moment without drinking. The other 2 clients, she said. One is waiting to see how the federal disclosure shakes out. One called 40 minutes ago and said, and I'm quoting, "Tell her the answer is still yes." Priya's voice had something in it that was close to pride but was more restrained, more professional, which was its own version of the same thing. The archive can be reconstructed from the digital copies. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Sloan nodded. And Dante Viscari's office called, Priya said. His attorney. Not Dante directly. What did they want? To inform you that the cooperation agreement includes a provision for independent verification of the financial documentation, meaning an outside forensic accountant confirms the accuracy of what's provided. His attorney wants to know if Mercer Blackstone would be willing to serve as that independent verifier. Priya paused. I told them I'd pass it along. Sloan was quiet. It's a legitimate contract, Priya said carefully. Good work. Clean scope. I know what it is. She looked at the lobby's glass front, the street outside, the evening dark, the city still moving in that particular way of cities that don't register what happens inside buildings. Tell them I'll review the scope document. Not yes, not no. Understood. They went to the hospital. The ribs were cracked, not broken. 2 of them, on the left side, which the attending physician confirmed with the specific professional neutrality of someone delivering information they wish were different. He told her what she already knew. No surgery, rest, anti-inflammatory, don't do anything that restricts breathing. She nodded through all of it. She checked into a different hotel than the one from the night before. This one was smaller, quieter, on a street she'd never stayed on. She asked for a corner room on a high floor, which was an old habit she'd developed during the years when security was a practical consideration, and which had become simply the way she slept. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while before she took off her jacket. She looked at the room. White walls, a window that showed city lights at a distance, furniture that was functional without being personal. Nothing that belonged to anyone. She was 41 years old, cracked ribs, a hotel room, her maiden name on the door, and in the morning she had to figure out the practical sequencing of the next 6 months. The archive reconstruction, the client communications, the legal separation, the specific tax implications of disentangling 15 years of financial life from another person's, the question of the house that had felt like a sentence and would now feel like a transaction. She took off her jacket. She looked at her hands in the room's lamplight. Steady. Marked across the palms from the catwalk railing, a pattern of thin horizontal lines that would fade in a few days. She looked at the hand that used to wear the ring, and then she stopped looking at it because that particular inventory wasn't useful tonight. She lay down. She didn't sleep immediately, but she lay still, which was the next best thing, and she let the day settle over her in layers the way days do when you finally stop moving. 3 weeks later, Lucian Viscari was formally charged. The charges were extensive. The weapons channel, the conspiracy to commit fraud, the manipulation of the organizational structure, the destruction of evidence in the warehouse fires. The filing ran 47 pages. Sloan read it at her desk in the reconstructed archive room, which still smelled faintly of new cardboard and fresh printed paper. And she read it with the careful attention she brought to all documents, and when she was done, she set it down and looked at the window for a moment. Her name appeared in the filing 22 times as the source of primary documentation. Dante's name appeared as the cooperating principal. His cooperation agreement, Harwell had confirmed through the appropriate channels, had been accepted. The terms included full financial disclosure, surrender of all criminal assets, and a structured restitution program administered through his legitimate holdings for families and individuals who had been harmed by the organization's operations over the previous 2 decades. It was not a light consequence. The legitimate holdings, 3 commercial properties, a logistics company, 2 investment accounts, would be substantially reduced by the restitution program. What remained would be enough to live on. Not the life he'd had. Enough. She thought about what that meant for him. She thought about it in the specific, unsentimental way she thought about most things. Not without feeling, but with feeling sorted and set aside from analysis. Then she went back to the Rotterdam Quarterly Report, which was due Thursday. Valeria pled to 2 counts. Sloan heard about it from Castillo, who called to inform her as a professional courtesy. The same professional courtesy that had been offered in the statement room and had been offered consistently throughout the 3 weeks of the federal process. Castillo was the kind of agent, Sloan had concluded, who believed that the people who provided the most useful evidence deserved to understand how it was used. It was a position Sloan respected. 2 counts, Castillo said. Conspiracy and obstruction. The Berenson Group connection is being investigated separately. That's a longer process, different jurisdiction. Will it land? Sloan asked. Can't say. What I can say is that the documentation you provided on the Berenson chain is the most complete picture we've seen of how they operate. It's going to be used. My name attached? Your company's name? Yes. Sloane was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. There's one more thing, Castillo said. Valeria Knox asked, through her attorney, if you'd be willing to speak with her before sentencing. The silence on the line lasted long enough that Castillo said, You don't have to. I know. Sloane looked at her desk, at the Rotterdam report, at the framed photograph she'd retrieved from the hotel in Priya's bag 3 weeks ago, which now sat in the same position it had sat in before. On the bookshelf, left side, her own face looking back from graduation day, younger and more tired-looking than she remembered feeling at the time. Tell her attorney, I'll think about it. She didn't think about it long. She said no 2 days later through Priya without explanation because no was a complete sentence, and she didn't owe Valeria Knox the courtesy of reasons. Dante came to the office on a Tuesday morning, 5 weeks after the mill. He came alone, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected the attorney, or at minimum a call from Priya to warn her. Instead, she looked up from the desk where she was working, and he was in the doorway, the actual doorway of her actual office, not the archive anteroom, not the lobby, because Priya had let him through, which Sloane noted and filed away for a conversation later about professional decisions she wanted to understand. He looked different. Not dramatically, it wasn't that kind of 5 weeks, but the particular quality of his stillness was different. The version of stillness he'd carried for years had been the stillness of a man conserving energy for the next confrontation. This was something else, something that had less direction to it and was therefore, paradoxically, less effortful. He'd lost weight. His jacket fit differently. He had not apparently replaced it. Priya said you were in, he said. Priya was correct. Sloane set down her pen. Sit down or don't. Either way. He sat. The chair across from her desk, the client chair, which she'd picked out herself from a warehouse sale 2 years ago because it was good quality and reasonably uncomfortable, which she found focused conversations, took his weight, and he sat forward in it, elbows on his knees, the posture of someone who is not going to pretend to be at ease. She looked at him across the desk. How are your ribs? He said. Healed, mostly. The face? Fine. It was fine. The bruising had gone through the usual stages and resolved by the end of the 2nd week. You look like you've been sleeping badly. I have. He didn't elaborate. The restitution program started last week. First disbursements went out. I saw the filing. The house is going into the liquidation pool. He said it without particular emotion, the way you say things you've finished processing. It'll take a few months to work through. You should know in case it affects anything you need from it legally. I don't need anything from it, she said. My attorney will contact Harwell about the remaining procedural items. He nodded. The quiet in the room had the quality of a room where a lot of things had already been said, somewhere else, in the past, and what was left was smaller and harder and more specific. The scope document, he said, from Harwell's office, the independent verification contract. I reviewed it. And? She looked at him. And I haven't decided. It's legitimate work. It falls within Mercer Blackstone's service scope. The rate is appropriate. She paused. I haven't decided if I want my company attached to the cleanup of something I spent 14 months trying to dismantle. He absorbed that. That's fair? I'm not asking for your opinion on what's fair. I know. He shifted in the chair. He looked at his hands, which were clasped between his knees, and then he looked up. I spoke with a reporter from the financial press. Not an interview, a background conversation. His voice was careful in the specific way of someone who has rehearsed what they want to say, but is not delivering it from the rehearsal. She's writing about the Viscari organization's history. The cooperation agreement is public record, so some of it's coming out regardless. She asked about the operational strategy, the port restructuring, the Ferrano negotiation, the consolidation work from the early years. Sloane said nothing. She was watching him. I told her those strategies originated with you, he said, that you were the operational architect of the organization's legitimate facing structure from the beginning, that the financial intelligence work was yours, and the strategic planning was yours, and the execution architecture was yours. And my role was primarily in the enforcement and relationship sides of the operation. Sloane looked at him for a long time. That's going to be in a financial press article, she said. Yes, about a criminal organization. The article is also about the cooperation agreement and the restitution program and the federal case. It's not a flattering piece about any of it, but it's accurate. He met her eyes. Your name connected to those strategies in the public record as the person who built them. That's value for Mercer Blackstone, even with the context. Maybe especially with the context given what the company does. She understood what he was doing. She understood it clearly, as she understood most things clearly, and she sat with it for a moment. You should have cleared that with me before speaking to anyone, she said. I know. I'm clearing it with you now. She hasn't filed the piece yet. If you want to be contacted directly, I can give you her information and you can provide your own account. He paused. If you want me to tell her to leave your name out entirely, I'll do that. What did you tell her about Valeria? He looked at her steadily. That she was a calculated introduction by Lucian designed to destabilize the marriage and create an access point. That I made it easy for both of them by not being present in the ways that mattered. Sloane looked at the desk, at the Rotterdam report she'd set aside when he came in, at the framed photograph on the shelf. The reporter's name, she said. He took out his phone and read it to her. She wrote it down. I'll contact her directly, Sloane said. I'll decide what I want to say. Okay. Not for Mercer Blackstone's benefit. For the record. Because I spent 15 years not being in the record, and I'm done with that. Okay, he said again. And then quieter. Good. She looked at him. He stood. He straightened his jacket by habit, the jacket that fit differently. And he looked around her office the way he'd looked around it on the opening day, except this time the difference in his looking was that he knew what he was seeing. Not a successful wife's interesting hobby. A company. A built thing with her name on it that had survived 14 months of deliberate pressure and was still operating. I'm going to attend Lucian's hearing, he said, in case you thought I wasn't going to. I wanted you to know I am. Why? Because he said I was never what my father was. And maybe he was right. But I'm going to be in that room when the charges are read because whatever came before the end of this organization happens in front of me, not somewhere I pretend isn't occurring. She thought about that. She thought about Lucian on the catwalk step, his hands out, the posture of a man done running. She thought about a kitchen table at his mother's apartment, 47 years of knowing someone, and what it costs to sit across from that in a federal courtroom. That's your decision, she said. Yes. He moved toward the door. He stopped in the doorway, the same position she'd seen him in 100 times over 12 years. Doorways being a place Dante had always paused, always evaluated whether to proceed. I'm not going to ask you for anything, Sloane. I know what I cost. I'm not here to renegotiate the price. She looked at him. I just wanted you to know about the reporter, he said, and about the hearing, and that you were right, 12 years ago, 2 years ago, all of it. Every time you tried to tell me something I didn't want to look at directly. He put one hand on the doorframe, briefly, the way you touch something solid when you need to remember it's there. You were always right. He left. She listened to his footsteps go down the hall, the elevator, the faint mechanical sound of the doors. She sat at her desk for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the Rotterdam report. The International Security Conference was held in March, 4 months later. It was a 3-day event in a convention center downtown, the kind of professional gathering that Sloane had attended for years as a peripheral presence, accompanying Dante to panels where he was speaking, standing in the networking receptions holding wine she didn't particularly want, listening to people discuss risk management and financial intelligence and strategic analysis. In language she could have improved and didn't because it wasn't the room she'd been given. This time, she was speaking. Mercer Blackstone was presenting a case study on the use of long-form documentary intelligence in the disruption of financial crime networks. The case study was based on the Vescari operation, appropriately anonymized and legally cleared, and it had attracted attention in the registration numbers that had surprised even Priya, who tracked these things carefully. She dressed simply, dark jacket, the kind that fit, shoes she could stand in for 3 hours. She looked at herself in the mirror of the hotel room she'd booked near the convention center because she'd stopped staying at hotels with names that connected her to anything. And she looked the way she looked, 41, unadorned, unhurt in the ways that showed. She'd cut her hair slightly, not dramatically, just enough to feel like something she'd chosen rather than something accumulated. She took the elevator down. The green room had coffee and a table and 3 other speakers she introduced herself to with the calm efficiency of someone who has stopped performing warmth and started simply delivering it, which is a different thing, and people feel the difference. At 9:45, she walked onto the stage. The lights were the kind that make the audience into a shape rather than a collection of individual faces, and she stood at the podium and adjusted the microphone and looked out at the shape of the audience and felt, not the absence of nerves, because that would have been performance, but the specific steadiness of someone who has been practicing for this room their whole life and has finally been given a chair. She spoke for 40 minutes. She spoke about the architecture of long-term intelligence work. She spoke about the patience required to document something carefully before acting on it, about the difference between having information and having evidence, about the specific challenge of working in environments where the ground shifts under you personally while you're trying to maintain analytical distance. She spoke about what it costs to be accurate about people you're close to. She said that part plainly, without softening it, and the room was quiet in a way that told her it had landed. She did not speak about Dante by name. She did not speak about the marriage by name. She spoke about a case, and anyone who knew, knew, and anyone who didn't heard it as the professional account it also was. At the end, she took questions for 15 minutes and answered each one directly and completely, and without performing either modesty or certainty beyond what she actually felt, which was the hardest version of answering questions and the only one worth doing. When she finished, the audience rose. Not all at once. It moved through the room in sections, the way real applause does, starting at the front and spreading, and it was the sound of 600 people deciding simultaneously that what they'd heard was worth standing for. She stood at the podium and took it without deflecting it, and without letting it run longer than it meant to, and then she stepped back from the microphone and nodded once and walked off the stage. Dante was in the back of the hall. She'd known he might be. She hadn't expected it, and she hadn't prepared for it, but when she came off stage and circled to the back corridor and found the side door to the main hall to collect her bag, she saw him through the narrow window in the door. He was standing at the rear, near the last row, in the posture of someone who had arrived late and chosen to stay standing rather than disrupt anything. He was watching the stage, where the moderator was transitioning to the next segment. She stood at the window for a moment. Through the glass, he was reduced to outline, the specific shape of him, the set of his shoulders, the way he stood in rooms, which she had cataloged so thoroughly over so many years that she could identify it at any distance and in any light. He did not look toward the door. She thought about the kitchen ring on the dresser and the hotel room at 1 a.m. with bad coffee, and the catwalk railing cold under her palms, and the federal statement that ran 4 hours, and the Rotterdam report she'd gone back to after he left her office. She thought about what he'd said in her office. "I'm not going to ask you for anything." She believed him. That was the complicated thing. She believed him now in a way she hadn't been able to in years, because people who want something from you perform a version of themselves. And what she'd seen from him in her office was not a performance. It was someone sitting in the consequence of what they'd done, without flinching from it and without asking to be released from it. That was real. She knew what real looked like. She'd spent 15 years looking for it from him and finding approximations. It didn't change anything. Real too late is still too late. She picked up her bag. She pushed through the side door into the corridor and walked toward the main exit, and she did not go back through the hall, and she did not look through the window again, and she did not stop moving until she was in the bright, cold air of the street, with the city still going around her the way cities do, indifferent and ongoing and full of its own business. She stood there for a moment. She breathed. The air was cold enough to hurt, slightly, which was fine. She was 41 years old, and she had built a company and documented a criminal network and cracked a zip tie in the dark and stood on a catwalk and delivered 40 minutes to 600 people who had risen to their feet. And she was standing on a sidewalk in the cold March air with her ribs healed and her name in the federal record and a Rotterdam report due Thursday. And she was not happy, happiness being a condition that arrives and departs and is not a foundation you build on. She was present. That was the word. Present in her own life, in her own name, in the work she'd built, and the room she'd earned, and the decisions that belonged to her and no one else. She put her bag on her shoulder and started walking. The conference building behind her was lit against the evening sky, its windows warm and full of people deciding things. And the applause that had filled that room 40 minutes ago was gone now, absorbed into the walls, already becoming the past. She didn't need to hear it again. She had heard it once, clearly, in the right room, under her own name. That was enough. That would always be enough.